How to write the most basic piece of news. For example, a Tibetan man died 2 days after being released from prison. Of injuries sustained in prison, torture. In order to tell this news, you need to be able to answer 5 questions. Who, what, when, where, and why. And if you can answer these 5 questions, you can tell this piece of news. You can strengthen your article by adding quotes especially, a photo or photos, and then backstory related material, and give the reader an idea of why they did it and why this news is important. So let's write this news. Who did what? Tenzin Chodek died. When, where, and why? In a hospital in Lhasa, Tibet, Friday, just 2 days after being released from prison on medical parole. There, we've written this news. Tenzin Chodek died in a hospital in Lhasa, Tibet, Friday, just 2 days after being released from prison on medical parole. The most important thing you can use to strengthen your article is quotes. In this case, we have a quote from the Tibetan Center for Human Rights and Democracy, who have people on the ground. We want a photo that, as much as possible, represents the story. And then we want to provide some backstory, some related material, and give the reader an idea of why it's important and why they did it. So I will tell you a little about this news case, and you can form an idea for yourself of why or how we would tell this story. So, this man was arrested in 2008 for participating in the Machu protest. At that protest, and it was the first big protest in Tibet, pro-Tibet protest, Chinese authorities there opened fire and killed 12 Tibetans. He was sentenced to 15 years, and he was charged with being a leader of the protest or spearheading the protest. His father was a known activist in Tibet before, but he left the country in 1993. This man, Tenzin Chodek, was beaten in prison, according to sources. The prison officials tried to treat him in hospitals, 3 different hospitals, then gave up. They released him to his family, and he died 2 days later. He's not the only person, Tibetan, to have died on so-called medical parole this year. There was another one who was also released, or who's also charged for his participation in the same protests. So let's go through the article now and see how this was written. A Tibetan protester died Friday, just 2 days after being released from prison on medical parole. The Tibetan was 6 years into a 15-year prison term for participating in the 2008 Machu protest, at which Chinese police opened fire and killed 12 Tibetans. The man is the second Tibetan to die after being released on medical parole this year. Notice that we didn't include his name. That is called a blind lead. It's just because the reader does not know who Tenzin Chodek is, so in most cases we won't include that information in the first paragraph. But now we will. Tenzin Chodek, a little about his background and what happened to him. He began to deteriorate in prison. They tried treating him, and they released him to his family. The quote that talks about what kind of condition he was in. Then what happened? He died 2 days after his release. A little about his death. He died at the hospital after his family brought him there. Backstory. Chodek was arrested in 2008 for his participation in the protests. He was sentenced to 15 years and 100,000 yuan, and according to sources was beaten and tortured in prison. Reportedly, police interrogations focused on Chodek's father, his name, who he was, and what happened to him, and what happened to Chodek. His interrogation involved claims that his father was instigating him. Also related material, earlier this year, another Tibetan protester, Gosho Lobsang, also died on medical parole. And in this case, we have a read more to this very story. A lot of journalists include a closing paragraph. I don't often, but I really enjoy reading them.